Most of us take for granted that we'll have safe, nourishing food available to us wherever we live in North America. But that hasn't always been the reality, nor is it the reality consistently around the globe. Joining us now for more, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Evan Fraser. He's Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security in the University of Guelph's Department of Geography. And with us here in studio, Pierre Desrochers, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Toronto and the author of The Locovore's Dilemma in Praise of the 10,000-Mile Diet. Gentlemen, welcome both of you to the program. Just before we get started here, I would like to have our director, Sheldon Osmond, put some information up on the screen to set up the discussion to come. These numbers courtesy the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and it specifically has to do with livestock. About 20% of the world's pastures and rangelands, with more than 70% of the rangelands in dry areas, have been degraded to some extent, mostly through overgrazing, compaction, and erosion created by livestock keeping. In addition, fresh water is becoming increasingly scarce, with the livestock sector accounting for nearly 1/10 of global human water use. The livestock sector is probably the largest source of water pollution. It's estimated to emit 7.1 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per annum, representing 14.5% of all human-induced emissions. Demand for livestock products is projected to grow by 70% by the year 2050. Well, that sets it up. Why don't we, Evan, go to you first. How would you describe the impact of today's food supply on our environment?
Well, I think that the data, Steve, that you just presented sums it up. Our food systems, and in particular our livestock systems, are extremely damaging on the environment, extremely taxing on the environment. And anybody looking into the future is going to probably come to the conclusion that we will have to find either different ways of producing livestock or different sources of protein to enjoy in our diets.
Pierre, how would you characterize the food system process we have today?
Not perfect, but much better than it used to be. And the issue that I have with those types of studies is that they essentially make people like Buffalo Bill and 19th century bison hunters look like environmentalists. You know, what was better for the environment than wiping out the huge bison herds that you had in the Canadian prairies or the American northern plains? I mean, there used to be a lot of ruminants before modern livestock came along. So looking at those numbers by assuming that somehow there was a vacuum and there was nothing before is, I believe, a little bit misleading. And what this study tells you is that, yes, the rangeland over the world might be problematic, but the solution historically, if you remember, we had things like dust bowls in North America a century ago. I mean, soil erosion was a huge issue. It was really the global warming of environmentalists a century ago. Everybody was afraid that soil was being washed over the surface of the earth. And the solution was modern farming, confined feeding lots that a lot of people don't appreciate. Again, they're not perfect, but they're better than what used to be before. And what we need to do to help the earth is push forwards with new technologies and new innovations.
Evan, I'm not sure Pierre is sold. You want to go back at it one more time?
Well, I mean, on one hand, I totally agree with Pierre that we are developing new technologies to reduce agriculture's impact on the environment, and will continue to do so. So a huge way forward has to be to reduce our develop technologies and use production methods which are lighter on the environment. On the other side of the coin, I think we're also probably facing a situation where many of us are going to have to look at different types of proteins in particular in order to have a diet which is indeed sustainable for the sort of population that we're going to be facing.
So would you say the current agricultural model by which we get food from farm to plate is no longer sustainable?
Well, I guess my problem with that comment, Steve, is that we don't have a model. We've got many, many different models, and some of them in some contexts work really well and other ones don't. So for example, like let's just take a case of the pork producers in Ontario. If you look at them, some of those producers will be producing a lot of protein with relatively few greenhouse gas emissions, and others won't be. And so we can probably reduce greenhouse gas emissions from livestock by up to 30% simply by getting current farmers to all adopt best management practices. And that's going to take us a certain distance of the way towards a more sustainable food system. But I still think that we're also going to be having to look at alternative sources of protein and quite radically different production systems for at least parts of the human diet.
Pierre, I'm not happy to say this, but my hunch is that the vast majority of people watching us right now will not have visited a farm any time in the past year and really don't know or understand the system that gets a cow from its mother to our plate, and over what period of time it takes for that to happen. So can you take us through that chain?
Well, if you look at beef cattle, I mean, the simplest answer to that is that most beef cattle is born in the wild somewhere. It's fed on grass for about 6 months, a little bit longer if you look at different places over the world. And then it's finished in what is called a feeding lot, where you feed the animal grains or soybeans that were grown typically in a different region, trucked into a feeding lot. And that way you get, let's say, a kilogram of meat much more quickly and much more efficiently than if you let the animal roam the pasture land. So all studies that have looked at the amount of resources that it takes, let's say, to produce, let's say, 1 kilogram of meat, will tell you that modern agribusiness is much more efficient and actually emits much less greenhouse gases over the entire life cycle of the animal than the model that is being promoted as being more sustainable.
So from the moment the cow is born
Yes.
to the time it ends up on our plates,
Yes.
how much time would that probably, generally speaking, how long does that take?
That's around a year, a little bit more, a little bit less. It depends on what you're looking at. I mean, of course, you've got Kobe beef, you've got the beef that you find at Walmart. So let's a little bit, around a year, a little bit more.
And Evan, how does what we just described compare to the way things were, say, a century ago?
Well, to start off, I would like to say that I don't think we're talking about needing to go back to a system that was existing a century ago. We've got lots of technologies to help do things better now. And so I totally agree with Pierre on that. The system that was present a century ago would have essentially seen a cow born and raised to slaughter rate at a much slower time frame. It would take 4 or 5 years probably, and be on grass after weaning or after suckling that entire period. So that was the whole system of at about a year of age, putting a cow in a feedlot and feeding them soy and grain is the modern invention, that part of the system.
Pierre, obviously, farmers want to be as efficient as possible. They want to be as profitable as possible. They want to be as sustainable as profitable. And on the list of things that they want to be, where, in your view, does environmental sustainability rank?
Well, I grew up in a small town of about 800 people. Most people there were farmers. They had been there for several generations. And a lot of them were thinking of passing on the farm to their kids. A lot of them were not interested, by the way, but that's another issue. And, you know, the farm is their asset. They have no incentive whatsoever to reduce the value of their asset. So they try to manage it as best as they can. Because even if their kids don't want it, if they want to sell it to somebody else, to another farmer that is expanding its operation, well, obviously they want to get the best price possible out of it. And you won't get good value for your asset if you don't manage it properly.
Now, I understand the asset,
Yes.
if by the asset you mean the farm and or the livestock, but
Yes.
what about the environment around the asset? How much
Well, it's not
care-
in the interest of the farmer to pollute his water source or to damage the environment. Then again, it depends which environment you're in. I mean, if you're a flatland like, I don't know, southern Ontario, for example, well, obviously you want to manage soil erosion because if you grow oats or if you grow soybeans for a living, well, obviously the quality of your soil is what is your real asset, more than the buildings, more than anything else. And so if you consider as soil erosion, as you were mentioning before, the main environmental issue that farmers have to deal with, at least those that grow crops, then obviously it is in their own selfish interest to maintain their soil quality as best as they can.
and does that go for the mega farm as well as the family farm?
Well, it's the same. I mean, why would a mega farm ruin the quality of its soil? It's just simply not in the farmer's interest to do so.
I want to, sorry, Evan, you wanted to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to add to a couple points that Pierre just made. And generally speaking, I agree with him, except for the fact that there are certain things that our market, our capitalist market, doesn't really price very well, and therefore the farmer doesn't get very good signals to conserve it. So for example, I was on a feedlot in the US about 2 years ago, and on the outskirts of the feedlot was a 410,000 ton pile of manure. I tried to create a equivalency for that, and that's about 35,000 adult elephants worth of poo. And that was a staggering failure. I mean, there was a regulatory failure there because the government that had given that company a license without asking for a credible manure management plan. This was a feedlot that held 100,000 cows. But there was also a more systemic societal and economic failure because that pile of manure wasn't necessarily a source of pollution. It was actually a source of valuable soil nutrients. But because our economic system doesn't provide an adequate price for environmental pollution and has very cheap fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, this product, this 410,000 tons of manure, was simply sitting in the environment next actually to a river. So for any of us that remember the Walkerton disaster of about 20 years ago in Ontario, we're aware that cow poo and drinking water shouldn't be in the same place, yet we have a system that actually sort of rewards farmers, or if not rewards farmers, doesn't penalize farmers for actually behaving in that way, and doesn't in a direct saleable sense degrade their asset in the way that sort of Pierre is hoping would happen.
Well, I don't know about that particular case. All I can say is that I've talked to farmers in Kansas who tell me that they will get their hands on all the manure that they can from those feedlots. So I don't know if this was an isolated case, but from the farmers that I've talked to in those parts of the world, they're more than happy to put that manure to good use on their farm.
Gentlemen, let me move our discussion now to a conundrum that we really need to understand better, and that is so many people in this world who are stuffed and so many people in this world who are starving. Let's start by, I want to play a little clip of an interview that we did here on this program with Michael Pollan, a food writer, author. This was from, I think, a couple of years ago. Roll tape.
I said I couldn't promise you sustainable agriculture can feed the world. I can promise you that industrial agriculture is not feeding the world right now. We're growing 6,000 calories per person per day in the world right now. You only need 2,000 to live. So why do we have 1 billion people hungry right now? That's what the UN estimates.
1 billion people hungry, but how many people obese who are doing more than their 2,000?
Another billion.
Let's follow up on that with some more numbers here. We talk about hunger worldwide. 791 million people in developing countries were estimated to be chronically hungry when surveyed over the years 2012 to 14. That's actually down by 203 million since the early 1990s. Latin America and the Caribbean have made the greatest overall progress in increasing food security. There has actually been modest progress in sub-Saharan Africa and Western Asia, which have been afflicted, of course, by natural disasters and conflict. Similarly, however, simultaneously, you might say, obesity is on the rise, affecting 500 million people worldwide. The global prevalence of overweight and obese people has risen in all regions and is also increasing in nearly all countries. Those numbers, courtesy of the Food and Nutrition, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations from 2014. Okay, Evan, let's get into this. Why such disparity?
Well, I mean, it's a sad statement of the world where hunger is avoidable. The gross number of calories is there, and what we're facing, in my opinion, is much more of a distributional problem than it is of a production problem. So I look at the global food crisis as an environmental crisis, like we touched on in the last little conversation, but I also see it fundamentally as a distribution crisis, where hundreds of millions of people, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, are left outside of the system that is overnourishing many Canadians and Americans.
Pierre?
Well, for the first time in human history, poor people are fat. And, I think that this is a lesser problem than famine and starvation, so I just want to state that for the record. And as for the 800 million people that are still malnourished, in 1950, you had about 1 human being out of 2.5 that was malnourished on Earth. Today, it's 1 in less than 7, so there's been progress. And the people who are malnourished are typically those who are left outside, as Evan was implying, of the globalized food supply chain. So what we need to do is to get them to join the rest of the world, move most of these people out of the farm and into cities, and eventually they will have the same problem that we have now, which is that we get fat, yes. But ultimately, it's not an epidemic. I don't see cupcakes jumping into people's mouth. It's up to us to deal with that. And I would rather deal with poor fat people than poor starving people.
Well, let's look at the poor starving people. Evan, the numbers point out we are doing by a factor of hundreds of millions of people better today at feeding those who were previously starving than we were, say, 20 years ago. What are we doing right?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, first of all, again, for the record, this is a huge accomplishment. The drop in hungry people over the last 100 years is an enormous accomplishment, and it's one that we often sort of forget when we get preoccupied by rising population and climate change and whatnot. In my opinion, what we have to focus on are 2 different strategies to move forward. And I was confronted with these 2 strategies when I was in Rwanda about 18 months ago. And on the first day on my trip, I visited a World Bank project, and it was called the Rice Intensification Project, where the World Bank had worked with farmers to boost rice productivity in some fertile valleys. And they'd used hybridized seeds, they used fertilizers and pesticides, and had accomplished huge things, quadrupling of yield in some areas. And as a result, Rwanda was better fed. But I got a different picture when I left the fertile valleys and got up into some of these very remote hillside communities. And there I saw a chronic hunger and asked the people, largely female-headed households, women farmers, what the effect of this World Bank intensification project had been on them. And the answer was not very much. These people don't buy much food. They're left outside of the global economic system. They're left outside of almost any economic system. And for them, the best way of helping that sort of very marginal or vulnerable group was through capacity building, through training exercises, linking these women up with veterinarians so that they could bring piglets efficiently to market weight, helping teach them skills and get them access to small loans. And that sort of micro, very small social development oriented program was having much more effect on reducing hunger in that group than the World Bank Rice Intensification Project was in the fertile river valleys. Okay,
gentlemen, in our remaining time here, I'd like to start exploring the notion of food as a political tool, or the impact on geopolitics of food. And let's just read this here. This is from a survey from a few years ago. Despite the many possible contributing factors, the timing of violent protests in North Africa and the Middle East in 2011, as well as earlier riots in 2008, coincides with large peaks in global food prices. We identify a specific food price threshold above which protests become likely. These observations suggest that protests may reflect not only long-standing political failings of governments, but also the sudden desperate straits of vulnerable populations. If food prices remain high, there is likely to be persistent and increasing global social disruption. Evan, let's start on that. Can you talk about the ability of food prices and or shortages to cause global political unrest?
Well, this is a topic I've been thinking about for quite a few years now, and I was sort of started off by listening to Bob Marley, who said, "A hungry man is an angry man." And I talked to a bunch of Cameroonians following the riots in 2008 in Cameroon, and I asked them, well, what was the link between prices and riots? And I expected to hear a refrain on the Bob Marley quote, that they got hungry, they got desperate. But what I heard was interesting, because it wasn't that. One respondent told me that it was the cutthroat merchants, the damn business guys that don't give a damn about people. And that's what caused people to go out in the streets. So there's sort of an argument about moral anger. And so a group of graduate students and postdocs and I have done a bunch of surveys in Haiti and Cameroon, a number of other places, to explore this. And indeed, we're finding that high prices on their own aren't enough, but high prices linked with moral outrage, linked with urban unemployment, linked with political dissatisfaction, under those sort of conditions, then a food price rise can act as a catalyst. So I see food price rises more as a trigger for unrest as opposed to an underlying cause of unrest.
Pierre?
Well, you can go back to the Roman Empire and see the same thing. I mean, people were mad at the hoarders, they were mad at the Jews, they were mad at the speculators. So that's really nothing new. I mean, I'm not very religious, but I believe that the third horseman of the apocalypse is famine, right? And he comes along with a scale and prices are going up and people are rioting because prices are going up. This has been going on forever. So what we need to make sure, the only way to avoid these problems, I believe, is to globalize our food supply system, which will bring down prices, which will provide more resiliency in the system, because you can never have crop failures everywhere at the same time. So success in one region will mitigate the bad effects in another one. So you spread the risk, you globalize the system, you get rid of trade barriers, and you'll see a lot less food riots than you've seen in the recent past.
It's not something that people tend to think about top of mind, though. When you think about political rallies and demonstrations and unhappiness around the world, it almost always is rooted in a lack of freedom or liberty or social justice, not food prices. But food prices are a factor, aren't they?
Food prices, well, you know, they triggered the French Revolution, among other things, so talk about an impact on ideas. So again, I mean, the stomach comes first for many people. Well, for all of us, let's be honest, even policy heads like us. So but I mean, this is a very old story. This is nothing new, and it will be again, we'll have the same problem in the futures if we don't manage to liberalize our agricultural system.
Marie Antoinette, they didn't have enough money for bread.
Exactly.
She lost her head over it.
Actually, she didn't say that. It was Louis XIV's wife. But most people believe it's Marie Antoinette.
Evan, given everything that we've been talking about then, is it fair to say that we are, in the world today, experiencing a global food crisis?
So The short answer to that, I think, is yes, but it's not a crisis linked with production per se. It's a crisis linked with the environmental impact of agriculture. It's a crisis linked with the vulnerability of agriculture to climate change. And I think it's fundamentally a crisis linked with disempowerment and economic marginalization of hundreds of millions of people, as opposed to simply worrying about the number of calories produced per person per day. Because in that regard, we're doing great.
And Pierre, your view on whether we're in the midst of a crisis?
No, we're not. Things have been getting better, and if we want to solve the remaining pockets of poverty that we have, we need to bring those marginalized and subsistence farmers into the global food supply chain, move most of them out of poor rural areas and into cities, and then humanity will be even better off than it is at the moment.
Okay. Evan, I'm going to ask you to stand by because you're going to stick around for the next segment. Pierre Desrochers from the University of Toronto, we're grateful you could make some time for us at TVO tonight, so thank you for coming in.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.